On a hot May day in 1990, a luxury car was found engulfed in flames in the Arizona desert, and its owner, a bank fraud investigator named Lee Young, had vanished without a trace. The burning plum-colored Lincoln Town car, discovered 100 miles south of Phoenix, yielded few clues. What it left behind was an enduring mystery that sounds like a movie, complete with missing jewels, cryptic phone calls, and whispers of a Colombian cartel. More than 3 decades later, the disappearance of Leroy Young remains unsolved. Lee Young was a 56-year-old bank executive and fraud investigator living in Scottsdale, Arizona. By all accounts, he was a devoted family man, married to his wife, Connie, and a respected professional. In addition to his banking career, Lee had a side passion as a jeweler. He often bought and sold jewelry in his spare time, and was known to carry plenty of cash for those deals. He even wore a distinctive copper-faced Rolex watch encrusted with diamonds, a personal trademark that would later become a key detail in his case. As a fraud investigator, Lee's job was to delve into financial irregularities. In early 1990, he was working on a sensitive case. He suspected that his Scottsdale bank was being used by criminals to launder money, potentially involving a Colombian cartel. Lee had reached out to federal authorities about these suspicions, determined to uncover the truth behind the illicit funds flowing through the bank. On May 4th, 1990, Lee Young went about his day as usual until lunchtime, when he met with a colleague at Coco's restaurant on North Scottsdale Road. He was last seen leaving the restaurant around 12:30 p.m., presumably heading back to work or to run errands. However, Lee never returned home that evening. At some point that afternoon, something mysterious happened, and Lee was never seen again. That day, after 3 p.m., a series of phone calls were made from Lee's car phone under puzzling circumstances. Records show that 1 incoming call was received, and 3 outgoing calls were dialed from the car phone later that afternoon. One of the numbers called was a payphone, and 2 others were to a woman who, when contacted, insisted she had never spoken with Lee that day. This raised the alarming possibility that these calls were made by someone other than Lee. Detectives noted that it's entirely possible Lee was already in danger by early afternoon, and that any calls made after about 2 p.m. might have been placed by the perpetrator. In other words, the very person responsible for Lee's disappearance could have been using his car phone, possibly to misdirect investigators. Friends and family grew concerned when Lee didn't come home on May 4th, and by the next morning, their worst fears were realized. On May 5th, 1990, the day after Lee disappeared, a deputy sheriff in Pinal County came upon a shocking sight in the remote desert near Oracle, Arizona. It was a Lincoln Town car blazing on the side of a dirt road. By the time authorities extinguished the flames, the car was burned to its frame. It was soon identified as Lee Young's car, though there was no sign of Lee himself at the scene. Due to the extensive fire damage, any potential forensic evidence was completely destroyed. The location of the burning car, about 100 miles south of Phoenix in a sparsely traveled area, deepened the mystery. When investigators combed through the wreckage of Lee's 1989 town car, they made a perplexing discovery. In the trunk of the car, remarkably intact despite the fire, they found a cache of jewelry valued at several $1,000s. This was inventory that Lee likely carried for his side business in jewelry trading. Notably, however, a couple of critical items were missing. Lee's cherished Rolex watch, the one he always wore, was gone, and so was his briefcase full of work documents. This briefcase was believed to contain files and notes from his bank fraud investigations. The car's passenger compartment was too badly burned to yield much else, but the absence of the briefcase and watch spoke volumes. These missing items would soon steer the investigation toward possible motives. The cops initially wanted to write the whole thing off as a robbery gone wrong, but Lee's family pushed back hard against this narrative. Connie Young, Lee's wife, was adamant that a random robbery didn't seem to fit the facts. She pointed out that aside from Lee's personal Rolex, none of the other jewelry or valuables were taken from the car's trunk. The one thing taken from the trunk wasn't cash or gems, but Lee's briefcase of investigative files, an item of importance to Lee's work rather than his personal wealth. This clue was a glaring one. It suggested that whoever was responsible might have been far more interested in what Lee was working on than in what he was carrying. Investigators treated Lee Young's case as a likely foul play situation from the start. There was no evidence that Lee left on his own accord. His bank accounts were untouched, and he had no known reason to disappear voluntarily. The condition and location of the car strongly hinted at criminal involvement, and Scottsdale police officially classified Lee's case as a suspected slaying. With the physical evidence scarce, detectives had to rely on circumstantial clues and Lee's background to hypothesize what happened. Two primary theories emerged and would come to dominate discussions of the case. One initial theory was that Lee Young fell victim to a robbery that spiraled out of control. It wasn't hard to see why this idea surfaced. Lee's lifestyle could make him a target for thieves. He was a well-dressed businessman, often seen wearing an expensive Rolex, and it was well known that he carried large amounts of cash to facilitate on-the-spot jewelry purchases. To an opportunistic criminal, Lee might have seemed like someone carrying a small fortune on any given day. The scenario imagined by this theory is that perhaps, after Lee left the restaurant on May 4th, someone approached him and then robbed him. In this line of thinking, the criminal might have forced Lee to drive out to the desert, taken his valuables, and disposed of his body somewhere in the vast Sonoran desert. However, as investigators dug deeper, the robbery theory started to falter. The crime scene didn't fit the pattern of a typical robbery. The presence of all that jewelry left untouched strongly suggested that theft wasn't the primary motive. It's possible the perpetrator overlooked the jewelry or couldn't find it in the dark trunk, but that seems unlikely given how much wealth was left behind in the open. Additionally, while Lee's fancy Rolex was missing, consistent with a robbery motive, it could also have been removed for other reasons. For instance, it could have been removed to make it look like a robbery, or a hitman could have gotten greedy. The second, far more sinister theory is that Lee Young was targeted because of his investigation into a money laundering operation. In the months leading up to his disappearance, Lee had been zeroing in on irregular transactions at the bank where he worked. He suspected that large amounts of illicit money were being funneled through accounts there, cleaned to appear legitimate, a classic money laundering scheme. Lee's inquiries had pointed toward a Colombian cartel as the source of these funds. He was sufficiently concerned that he alerted federal law enforcement agents who specialized in smuggling and money laundering. He was essentially blowing the whistle on what he believed was a dangerous conspiracy. Federal agents did take his information and were looking into the case. In fact, Lee remained in contact with those agents. About a week before he vanished, he tried to reach out to them again, but was unable to get in touch. This suggests that something he discovered might have alarmed him enough to urgently seek help, or perhaps he sensed he was in danger. Those who support the cartel theory believe that Lee's investigation hit a nerve with very dangerous people. If a cartel was indeed laundering millions through an Arizona bank, an internal investigator like Lee Young would pose a serious threat to their operation. Eliminating him and destroying his evidence could have been seen as the only way to protect their lucrative enterprise. Under this theory, what happened on May 4th, 1990, wasn't a random crime at all, but a planned hit. Lee could have been lured into a meeting under false pretenses, perhaps someone pretending to be a source or client, and then abducted him to silence him. The fact that Lee's briefcase of files disappeared aligns with this scenario. The perpetrators might have seized his documents to find out how much he knew, or to erase the proof of their activities in a pre-digital world. One angle amateur sleuths have speculated on is whether Lee's greatest danger didn't come from outside the bank, but from within. And personally, I prefer this theory, even though I have to admit it's based entirely on circumstantial evidence. As an internal fraud investigator, Lee was probing sensitive transactions and asking questions about accounts that may have been used to funnel cartel money. If he was closing in on proof, it's plausible that someone inside the institution, perhaps a colleague with divided loyalties, saw him as a threat. Banks were not and are not immune to infiltration by bad actors, and organized crime groups often seek insiders who can work with them on their schemes. If such a person existed at Lee's bank, their priority would have been to keep the money flowing and the operation undiscovered. Lee's persistence could have forced their hand. The missing briefcase becomes even more suspicious in this context, since an insider would know exactly what kind of information he carried and why it was dangerous. Rather than a faceless cartel operative striking at random, Lee may have been undone by someone he worked alongside every day. Under this theory, an insider who provided access, arranged the ambush, and ensured his files never reached federal investigators. Further yet, this insider would have been able to use the documents which Lee carried to cross-reference with documentation in the bank as well. Of course, the most sinister theory of all is that the feds were compromised and tipped the cartel off to Lee Young's investigation. I see this as a less likely possibility given that federal agencies are much more difficult to infiltrate than a fairly small bank in Arizona. That said, it's not something that can be dismissed entirely. In the 35 years since Lee Young vanished, his family and friends have had to live without answers. Lee Young's disappearance has continued to remain a chilling Arizona unsolved mystery. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a reminder to like and subscribe, share the video, and check out the Patreon. Also, don't forget to check out the podcast, Lazy Chill True Crime, which includes some of the content on here, as well as bonus content you won't hear anywhere else. Search it up wherever you get your podcasts, or click one of the links in the description. It began not with a bang, but with a void. On the morning of Tuesday, August 22, 1911, a French painter named Louis Béroux walked into the Louvre's Salon Carré to set up his easel. He planned to sketch Leonardo da Vinci's portrait of Lisa del Giocondo, a respected Renaissance work known to the French as La Joconde. But where the painting should have been, there was only a blank space on the wall, marked by 4 iron hooks. The artist wasn't immediately alarmed. Museum staff often removed artworks for photography or cleaning. He asked a guard to check, but hours passed with no sign of the painting. It wasn't until late that afternoon, more than 24 hours after the fact, that the museum staff finally accepted the unthinkable. The painting known better to the world as the Mona Lisa was gone. Before this moment, the painting was a masterpiece, but it wasn't a global icon like it is today. It was the brazen theft and the empty space it left behind that would launch it into the stratosphere of fame. The crime itself was shockingly simple, a testament to the Louvre's laughably poor security in the early 20th century. The thief was Vincenzo Perugia, a 29-year-old Italian handyman who had previously worked at the museum. Ironically, his job had been to help build the very protective glass cases meant to safeguard the Louvre's treasures, including the Mona Lisa herself. This inside knowledge gave him a crucial advantage, and on Sunday, August 20th, he hid overnight in a storage closet, as was the style at the time. The next morning, a Monday when the museum was closed for maintenance, he emerged wearing a work outfit, blending in perfectly with the other staff. He walked into the deserted gallery, lifted the painting from its hooks, and carried it to a service stairwell. There, he removed the panel from its heavy frame and glass, leaving them behind. Tucking the masterpiece into his work clothes, he made for an exit, only to find the door locked. In a twist of fate, a passing plumber saw his struggle, and assuming he was a trapped co-worker, unlocked the door for him, allowing Perugia to walk out into the streets of Paris. Once the news broke, it created a media firestorm unlike any seen before for a work of art. The Mona Lisa's face was suddenly on the front page of newspapers around the world. The French borders were secured, and checkpoints were set up across the nation. Both public and private rewards were offered for the Mona Lisa's safe return. The theft became a national scandal, and the public became obsessed. When the Louvre reopened a week later, a strange phenomenon occurred. More people lined up to stare at the empty space on the wall than had ever visited to see the painting itself. They left flowers and notes, turning the void into a shrine for their missing icon. The police investigation, meanwhile, was a sprawling mess. They found a single thumbprint on the discarded frame but couldn't match it to anyone in their files. The case took a bizarre detour when suspicion fell on the avant-garde artist Pablo Picasso and the poet Guillaume Apollinaire. Needless to say, they weren't the criminals responsible for this heist, but the authorities tried their hardest to make the facts fit their bizarre theory of the case. Little did the authorities know, the Mona Lisa was essentially right under their noses. For 2 years, the painting remained hidden in a false-bottom trunk in Perugia's modest Paris apartment, just a few miles from the Louvre. The historical consensus on his motivation is complex. During his trial, Perugia presented himself as a patriot, claiming he stole the painting to return it to its rightful homeland. He believed, incorrectly, that it was one of the many artworks looted from Italy by Napoleon Bonaparte. In reality, Leonardo da Vinci had brought the painting to France himself and sold it to King Francis I centuries earlier. While Perugia may have harbored genuine nationalistic feelings, evidence strongly suggests a financial motive was at play. Letters to his family spoke of making his fortune, and his first move wasn't to gift the painting to the Italian state, but a crude attempt to ransom it back to Italy. Patriotism, it seems, was a convenient and highly effective defense, but profit was the likely goal. The end came in December 1913, when Perugia, using the alias Leonardo Vincenzo, wrote to an art dealer in Florence named Alfredo Geri, offering to sell him the Mona Lisa. And yeah, you don't have to rewind to hear that again. His alias was Leonardo Vincenzo. Geri, intrigued but suspicious, contacted Giovanni Poggi, the director of the Uffizi Gallery. They arranged a meeting at Perugia's hotel. There, the thief dramatically revealed the painting, pulling it from the secret compartment of his trunk. The two men authenticated the masterpiece by its brushwork and the Louvre's seal on the back, and then did something to one-up the audacity of the thief himself. Pretending they needed to finalize the purchase at the gallery, they took the painting for safekeeping and immediately called the police. At this point, it's probably pretty clear that Perugia wasn't the master thief he thought he was, and he was arrested soon after. The recovery was as sensational as the theft. Perugia was tried in Italy, where the public largely hailed him as a national hero due to his claim about having done it all for the glory of Italy and Italians. The Italian court was sympathetic, and he was given a lenient sentence of just over a year, ultimately serving only about 7 months in prison. Legend has it he received extreme preferential treatment from prison guards and the state, many of whom did see him as a legitimate Italian patriot. Before its return to France, the Mona Lisa went on a triumphal tour of Italy, exhibited in Florence, Rome, and Milan to massive, adoring crowds. When she finally returned to the Louvre in January 1914, more than 100,000 people came to welcome her home in the first 2 days. The theft had done what centuries on a palace wall could not. It had transformed a Renaissance masterpiece into a global icon. The world had learned the Mona Lisa's name, not just by seeing her enigmatic smile, but by feeling the profound shock of her absence. The true motivation for Perugia's theft remains mysterious, since there's no way he could have possibly been able to unload the art. That said, it looks as though his patriotism defense was an afterthought. All evidence seems to suggest that he saw the opportunity to swipe a valuable piece of artwork. However, it's important to remember that while he was stealing priceless art, the Mona Lisa he stole wasn't the mythologized painting of today. Without the theft by Perugia, it's unlikely that the Mona Lisa would have gone on to become the most famous piece of fine art in human history. And so, with that, it's interesting to consider that Perugia may have actually acted in a more patriotic way than he could have ever realized. After all, without his quote-unquote intervention, it's possible that we would be living in a world where Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Necklace is the equivalent of our Mona Lisa. Imagine a moonless midnight on a lonely dirt crossroads in rural Mississippi. A young bluesman stands at the barren intersection, guitar in hand, desperate for a way to become great. According to legend, Robert Johnson was that man, and on this eerie night, a tall, mysterious figure approached out of the darkness. The stranger, said to be Satan himself, silently took Johnson's guitar, tuned the strings, and played a few haunting chords before handing it back. In that fateful moment, the story goes, Robert Johnson struck a deal with the devil, exchanging his very soul for otherworldly musical talent. When the phantom vanished into the night, Johnson was left standing at the crossroads with mastery of the blues, and a curse that meant his soul now belonged to the devil. It's a chilling tale that sounds like pure folklore, yet it has become one of the most enduring mysteries in American music history. How did this humble Mississippi musician come to be at the center of a supposed Faustian pact? And what truth lies behind the legend of the bluesman who bargained with the devil? To understand that, we must first meet Robert Johnson himself, the man behind the myth. Robert Johnson was no ordinary musician, at least not in retrospect. Born in 1911 in Hazelhurst, Mississippi, he lived in the heart of the Delta, the cradle of blues music. Johnson's early life was marked by hardship and restlessness. He was a small, slight young man with a hunger to make music, known initially for playing harmonica as a boy. However, his dream was to become a great blues guitarist and singer. In the late 1920s, Johnson hung around older bluesmen trying to hone his guitar skills. By all accounts, he wasn't very good at it, and the legendary bluesman, Son House, later remembered the young Robert Johnson as a, quote, embarrassingly bad guitarist. This lack of early talent makes what happened next in Johnson's life all the more perplexing and perhaps ripe for legend. Around 1930, Johnson vanished from the blues circuit, and most people thought this hopeless young man gave up on his improbable dream. Then something very weird happened, which set the stage for the legend surrounding him. About a year later, when Johnson finally reappeared in the Delta, he was transformed. Seemingly overnight, he had become an absolute virtuoso on the guitar, able to outplay even the master guitarists who had once dismissed him. Fellow bluesman Johnny Shines recalled that Johnson could pick up any song after hearing it just once, whether blues, gospel, or more mainstream tunes. This was both strange and oddly disturbing, given Johnson's previously questionable abilities. Robert Johnson developed a complex, innovative style and a soulful singing voice that captivated those who heard him. It was as if Robert Johnson had unlocked a superhuman level of skill in a shockingly short time. Johnson spent the next several years, from 1932 to 1938, roaming the Delta and beyond as an itinerant musician. He played on street corners, and at country dances, and at rundown drinking establishments, and often just worked for a few dollars or a meal and a place to sleep. He was a rambling presence, known to hop trains or hitch rides, and he often used different names in different towns, adding to the aura surrounding him. In an era of segregation and hardship, the life of a young black bluesman was tough and often dangerous, but Johnson was committed to his music above all else. He finally got the chance to record in 1936 and 1937, cutting 29 songs in 2 sessions in Texas. These recordings, including future classics like Crossroad Blues and Sweet Home Chicago, showcased his eerie, expressive vocals and astonishing guitar technique. Yet during his lifetime, those records made only a minor ripple regionally. Johnson remained virtually unknown to the wider world and earned no fame or fortune to speak of while alive. In August 1938, at just 27 years old, Robert Johnson met an untimely and mysterious end. The most accepted story is that he was poisoned with strychnine by a jealous husband or bar owner, after Johnson reportedly flirted with the man's wife during a gig. Another version of events suggests that he was poisoned with dissolved mothballs. Still others suggest that his cause of death was perhaps something more occult-related. Whatever the case, what is known is that Johnson fell ill for days and died in painful convulsions near Greenwood, Mississippi. Unfortunately, his death certificate doesn't provide further insight into his cause of death, though one researcher was allegedly able to get a confession out of the poisoner. However, this confession was obtained on the condition that the researcher never publish the man's name. In the end, Johnson was buried in an unmarked grave, his passing barely noticed at the time. That could have been the end of what was, until then, his obscure story. But in death, Robert Johnson's music found new life. Long after he was gone, his records were rediscovered and hailed as masterpieces, influencing icons like Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, and Bob Dylan. By the 1960s, despite being unknown in life, Johnson was being hailed as the king of the Delta blues and was a near-mythic figure of American music lore. Central to that growing legend was the tale of the deal with the devil at the crossroads, a story that tried to explain how Robert Johnson became so extraordinary seemingly overnight. The legend of Robert Johnson's satanic deal is the stuff of pure Americana, a dark fable repeated and embellished for decades. In the popular version of the story, young Johnson's burning desire to be the greatest blues guitarist led him to a midnight rendezvous at a crossroads. Some say it was the junction of Highways 61 and 49 in Clarksdale, Mississippi, which is today marked by a trio of hanging guitars on a pole. Other locations have also been suggested, and while the exact location varies, the core myth is the same. Robert Johnson waited by the crossroads on a moonless night, guitar in hand, until the devil showed up to answer his prayer. In that moment, Robert Johnson's soul was sealed in a devilish bargain. In exchange, he was granted otherworldly mastery of the guitar, the ability to summon haunting melodies and soul-piercing blues whenever he played. The legend pointedly parallels the story of Faust, the man who sold his soul for knowledge and power. Here, the currency was the blues. Johnson walked away from the crossroads with the devil's tuning and a pact signed in blood, destined to become the unrivaled king of Delta blues. The cost of this varies in the telling, but every version accepts that eternal damnation is part of the deal, while other versions add that he would only ever achieve fame in death. It's easy to see why such a sensational story caught on. Johnson's rapid transformation from mediocre guitarist to virtuoso seemed almost supernatural to those who knew him. The Mississippi Delta in the 1930s was steeped in spirituality and superstition. People spoke in whispers about hoodoo magic, spirits, demonic pacts, and deals struck under midnight moons. The blues itself was often condemned by church-going people as the devil's music, sinful by nature. In Johnson's case, he literally sang about demons and hellhounds, which only added fuel to the fire. Songs like Me and the Devil Blues paint a portrait of waking up to Satan knocking on his door, and Hellhound on My Trail speaks of being chased by demonic dogs. It wasn't hard for listeners to connect these lyrics to the legend, and in his most famous track, Crossroad Blues, Johnson moans about going down to the crossroads and kneeling to beg for God's mercy. This is a haunting scene that many later interpreted as a reference to his midnight meeting with Satan. Under this interpretation, the song is based on Johnson going back to the same place where he made the deal with the devil to plead with God for his soul back. Whether Robert Johnson factually attempted to make a pact with the devil actually yields an answer that's much more unusual than you would expect. This answer also provides significant insight into the chilling aura that this bluesman cultivated in his own lifetime. While the Crossroads legend makes for a spooky origin story, researchers and those who knew Johnson have offered far more earthly explanations for his musical metamorphosis. For one, that year or two when Johnson disappeared from the music scene wasn't spent summoning demons, but dedicated to intense practice. But here's the thing. The practice Robert Johnson underwent was quite bizarre, and reads like something out of the origin story of a character from a horror flick. Johnson sought out a mentor, an older bluesman named Ike Zimmerman, who was renowned for his guitar skill. As it happens, Zimmerman had an unusual teaching method. He and Johnson would sit in quiet graveyards around the midnight hour to practice guitar, believing it was a peaceful place where no one would disturb them. But it gets a bit weirder, since Zimmerman himself claimed that he received his musical abilities not by conventional means, but by communing with the dead in cemeteries. Some have interpreted this unusual method of practicing guitar as being an occult ritual, and as providing some verification for the legend surrounding Johnson. Another key to the puzzle lies in a little bit of folklore crossover that happened due to another contemporary blues musician with a similar name making some sensational claims. It turns out the story of a blues player selling his soul at a crossroads didn't originally belong to Robert Johnson at all. A contemporary Delta bluesman named Tommy Johnson had been openly bragging about a similar devilish deal years earlier. Tommy Johnson, who wasn't related to Robert, would tell people he sold his soul to the devil to explain his own guitar prowess. When blues scholars and enthusiasts in the 1960s started digging up Robert Johnson's story, it appears that Tommy's devil deal legend got mashed together with Robert's life. The likely truth is that Robert Johnson's immense talent and Tommy Johnson's colorful myth were fused into one compelling narrative, and thus the ultimate blues legend was born. This legend was of course bolstered by the fact that those closest to Robert Johnson knew that he practiced guitar at midnight in graveyards, an act that was disturbing to religious Southerners. In an interview decades later, Son House, that elder bluesman who knew Robert as a youth, was asked about the Crossroads myth. He said that if he hadn't seen Robert's improvement with his own eyes, he would say that he must have sold his soul to the devil. This interview was taken out of context and sensationalized. House was simply stating that if he hadn't seen it happen himself, the only way he could explain it would be some sort of occult intervention. But he had seen it himself, so it was clear the devil wasn't involved. Further, long after Robert died, his family stated that he had sold his soul in interviews decades later. However, in the context they're talking about, it's clear they don't mean a literal pact with the devil. What they're talking about is Robert Johnson's decision to become a bluesman rather than to play gospel music. Real or not, the tale of Robert Johnson's deal with the devil has proven irresistibly compelling, ensuring that his name lives on in popular culture. In the decades after his passing, as his music reached new audiences, the Crossroads story went viral along with his music. Johnson's posthumous fame itself added credibility to the myth. Here was a man who died penniless and unknown, yet by the 1960s he was being lauded as the greatest Delta bluesman ever, with record sales climbing worldwide. To the superstitious, it almost felt as if Robert Johnson got his true reward only after death. It was a warm February afternoon in 1988 in Honolulu, and 12-year-old Ji Zhao Lee was doing something every kid her age might do. She was going door to door selling fundraiser tickets in her neighborhood. The streets around Nuuanu Avenue felt safe in those days, a time when many in Hawaii believed their idyllic community was immune to horrors like child abduction. Yet by nightfall, that ordinary after-school activity had turned into every parent's nightmare. Ji never came home that evening, and the mystery of what happened to her has haunted the islands ever since. Ji Zhao Lee was a bright, hard-working girl who had moved to Hawaii with her family just a couple of years before her disappearance. Born in China in the mid-1970s, she was the middle of 3 daughters. Her parents had kept her and her younger sister hidden in China due to the one-child policy until they could move the family to Honolulu for a better life and a taste of freedom. Once in Hawaii, she adjusted well at Royal Elementary School. By early 1988, she was eagerly helping with a school fundraiser to raise money for a class trip to the Big Island. On February 11th, 1988, Ji set out after school with a stack of raffle tickets to sell for the fundraiser. She left her family's apartment with her ticket book in hand and promised to be home by 6, as her mother had instructed. Her mother even gave her a wristwatch to keep track of time, and she vowed not to be late. With that, the 12-year-old headed out to make as many sales as she could for her class. Bystanders later recalled seeing Ji Zhao outside a 7-Eleven store on Nuuanu Avenue and Kwakini Street around 4:45, politely asking people if they would buy a ticket. At some point, witnesses reported that a girl matching Ji's description may have gotten into a light-colored 1950s Chevrolet sedan. This distinctive detail stood out, and police treated it as a critical clue. A classic car like that was uncommon, and it was the only lead they had into who might have encountered the 12-year-old that day. By 6 o'clock, when Ji still hadn't come home, her mother grew alarmed. The Lee family began frantically searching the area, calling out her name and knocking on neighbors' doors, but found no sign of her. Finally, early the next morning, they filed a missing person report with the Honolulu police. Police launched an intensive search, and the community rallied to help. About 2,000 volunteers joined officers in combing the surrounding neighborhoods for any trace of the missing girl. Teams scoured streets, yards, and even streams, while helicopters flew overhead and divers checked nearby waters. In all, tens of thousands of man-hours were devoted to the search over the following weeks. Despite this massive effort, no physical evidence of the missing girl would ever be recovered. Investigators focused on the tip about the 1950s Chevy and painstakingly tracked down every similar car on Oahu. They interviewed each owner, hoping for a break in the case, but unfortunately, that lead went nowhere. A composite sketch of an unknown man seen near the 7-Eleven was released to the public, but he was never identified. With no witnesses and no evidence beyond the initial sighting, the investigation hit a heartbreaking dead end. As months passed with no answers, the case went cold. Authorities came to believe that G had most likely been abducted by a stranger and met with foul play. For the Lee family, life would never be the same, and her father spent years walking the streets, asking anyone who would listen if they saw anything that day. Her mother kept their phone number unchanged and would sit by the phone each night, holding on to hope that one day G might call. Over the years, police fielded many tips and possible sightings, but none ever led to any breakthroughs. The leading theory is that a predator seized the opportunity to kidnap her in broad daylight. With no evidence or suspects identified, investigators suspect she was likely slain soon after being taken. Another equally disturbing possibility is that she was abducted as part of a trafficking operation and then eliminated as she grew older. However, no evidence exists to support this theory, and it remains pure speculation. Despite the passage of time, her family continues to hold out hope that she remains alive. Transcendental meditation is a mental technique that's gained global attention for its purported ability to relieve stress, promote relaxation, and enhance overall well-being. Transcendental meditation's popularity exploded in the 1960s and 1970s, largely because of famous practitioners such as the Beatles, who studied under Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. The Maharishi was born in India and studied under Gurudev Swami Saraswati before developing a streamlined approach to meditation that would appeal to a global audience. He believed that mental transformation could translate into societal and even global change, leading him to found the International Meditation Society in 1957. By the 1970s, transcendental meditation was being taught to hundreds of thousands of people across the United States, Europe, and other continents. Central to Maharishi's vision was the idea that one could access a fourth state of consciousness beyond waking, dreaming, and deep sleep by using a personalized mantra. He argued that this mantra would help the mind settle into a state of profound restfulness and heightened alertness. Although this approach has roots in ancient Indian spiritual practices, the form presented by Maharishi was adapted for modern lifestyles, emphasizing ease of practice and broad accessibility. The main concept behind TM is that the mind naturally seeks fulfillment or happiness. Proponents believe that, left to its own devices, the mind will gravitate toward deeper, more harmonious levels of awareness if given the chance. Transcendental meditation provides that chance by using a mantra, often a Sanskrit sound given by a certified teacher, which serves as a mental vehicle. During a session, the practitioner silently repeats the mantra, and if thoughts arise, they're not resisted, but gently acknowledged and replaced with the mantra. Another key principle is that meditation should feel effortless. Unlike other forms of meditation that might involve focused attention or specific breathing patterns, TM aims for a state where the mind freely transcends mental activity. This is thought to allow for effortlessly dipping into quieter layers of consciousness. Proponents argue that when the mind is allowed to settle in this manner, it naturally experiences what's described as pure awareness, or a deep sense of calm. A third principle emphasizes consistency. Practitioners typically meditate twice a day for about 20 minutes, once in the morning and once in the late afternoon or early evening. Adhering to this schedule is said to maximize the benefits, especially the long-term accumulation of inner tranquility and stress reduction. During these sessions, practitioners sit upright in a comfortable position with eyes closed, minimizing distractions. It's also important to note that TM does not require any specific religious or philosophical belief. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi stressed that people from any background, or none at all, could benefit from the technique. According to practitioners, many individuals practice TM for purely health or psychological reasons, rather than spiritual ones. The Greater Key of Solomon is one of the most well-known grimoires in Western occult tradition. Despite its association with King Solomon, scholars generally agree that it originated in the 14th or 15th century during the Italian Renaissance. This text reflects the era's fascination with esotericism and ceremonial magic, blending Christian, Jewish, and pre-Christian Greco-Roman influences. The grimoire is divided into two primary books. The first focuses on summoning and commanding spirits, offering instructions on invocations, prayers, and rituals. These rituals are elaborate and require significant preparation, including purification processes for the practitioner. Practitioners are directed to maintain physical and spiritual purity, emphasizing the importance of discipline and focus in working with spiritual entities. The second book details the construction and use of magical tools such as pentacles, swords, and wands. It explains the materials and techniques for crafting these objects and stresses the importance of timing, aligning their creation with specific astrological conditions. Each tool is inscribed with symbols and names of power, believed to imbue the items with the ability to control or direct spirits. The careful attention to these tools highlights the grimoire's systematic approach to magic. The rituals described in the Greater Key of Solomon often involve invoking divine names and commanding spirits to perform tasks or share knowledge. The practitioner is portrayed as a figure who, through purity and faith, has the authority to wield power over these entities. This perspective aligns with the medieval Christian worldview, where divine authority superseded all other powers. Despite being attributed to King Solomon, there is no historical evidence connecting him to the text. Solomon's biblical reputation as a wise king with command over spirits likely inspired the association. In Jewish folklore, Solomon is credited with controlling demons to build the temple in Jerusalem, a narrative that influenced later Christian magical traditions. By attributing the grimoire to Solomon, the authors lent it an air of authority and mystique. The text has survived in various manuscripts and translations. One of the most influential modern versions was translated by MacGregor Mathers, a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, in the late 19th century. Today, the text remains a key resource for ceremonial magicians and occult enthusiasts. The story of Pope Joan is one of the medieval world's most fascinating mysteries. It tells of a woman who allegedly disguised herself as a man, climbed the ranks of the church, and briefly reigned as pope, until a dramatic gender reveal ended her life. The tale of the first and only female pope first surfaced in the chronicles of the 13th century and spread widely across Europe, and even gained official church recognition for a time. History says every pope was a man. Now let's explore if the truth says otherwise. The earliest known account appears in a Latin chronicle by Jean de Mailly, a Dominican friar writing around 1250. His Chronicle of Metz contains the first mention of an unnamed woman pope, though he sets her story in the year 1099 and doesn't give her a name. According to his brief report, a talented woman concealed her gender and became a curial secretary, then a cardinal, and finally, pope. The deception was revealed when she went into labor and gave birth during a public procession. In this telling, the consequences were dire. She was tied to a horse's tail and dragged through the streets of Rome, before being stoned and then buried. Jean de Mailly even added that a fast was instituted in memory of this event and her punishment. This initial version is brutal and cautionary, reading like a morality tale of the results of deception unveiled, rather than an actual historical account. Later in the 13th century, another Dominican chronicler, Martin of Troppau, included an expanded version of the female pope story in a popular compendium of papal and imperial histories. Martin's Chronicon Pontificum et Imperatorum became one of the most widely read chronicles of the later Middle Ages, and its account of the female pope was especially influential. In Martin's version, new details appeared that set the template for the legend. The woman pope was given an identity, John Anglicus of Mainz, implying an Englishwoman born in Mainz, Germany. Martin placed her in the 9th century after the pontificate of Pope Leo IV, who died in 855. He wrote that after Leo, an Englishwoman who hailed from Germany, who went by John Anglicus, occupied the papal throne for over 2 years. Martin's narrative fleshes out her backstory. She was an exceedingly intelligent young woman who wanted to pursue further education. The only problem was, educational opportunities for her were extremely limited, so her and her lover cooked up a plan. They would go to Athens to further her education, but they would present themselves as two men seeking further knowledge in this ancient center of learning. While in Athens, she quickly proved to be far superior to her peers intellectually, and was brought to Rome where she taught science and theology. Her intellectual capacity and moral character were so universally respected that she was eventually chosen as pope. However, things ended up going off the rails in a very big way. She became pregnant, and the inevitable happened during a papal procession between St. Peter's and the Lateran Basilica. Caught in a grand religious procession, the disguised pope went into labor and delivered a child in the street, in full view of the astonished populace. Martin's chronicle says she perished during childbirth, not as a result of an angry crowd, and notes that after that, future popes avoided passing that particular spot in processions. This female pope, according to this telling, was then rapidly buried where she perished, and the baby became a ward of the church. Interestingly, according to this account, her son later became the Bishop of Ostia, in Italy, and saw to her receiving a proper burial. It's with Martin's account that the name Joan or Joanna entered the legend. Martin's authority on historical matters was taken very seriously by contemporaries. He was a papal chaplain, and his chronicle was read widely as factual history. Further, the sensational nature of the anecdote meant that the tale of Pope Joan spread rapidly, as the idea of a pregnant pope is a story that's built to rapidly spread. Once inserted into popular chronicles and literature, the story of Pope Joan spread throughout Europe, capturing the medieval imagination. During the 14th and 15th centuries, the legend was often accepted as historical fact. Many people didn't doubt that a woman had once been pope. It was retold by preachers, included in encyclopedic works, and referenced by scholars of the time. For example, the Italian author Giovanni Boccaccio in 1363 wrote about the female pontiff, giving her a place among notable women of history, albeit as a cautionary tale of pride. A woodcut illustration from a 1474 printed edition of Boccaccio's work even depicts Pope Joan in the very moment of giving birth, baby in arms, wearing the papal tiara. This vivid image shows how concretely the story was imagined in late medieval culture. Some historians also speculate that the High Priestess card for 15th century tarot decks is a reference to Pope Joan, though this can't be confirmed with certainty. Medieval commentators casually invoked Pope Joan as a real person. Notably, the Czech reformer Jan Hus, during his trial for heresy at the Council of Constance in 1415, referred to the example of a female pope to challenge church authority. Despite this being a heresy trial, no one on the council pushed back and argued that she was mythical. The fact that even loyal churchmen during a heresy trial didn't publicly object to Huss's mention indicates that the historicity of Pope Joan was accepted. Serious doubts about the Pope Joan narrative only began to surface after hundreds of years of uncritical repetition. As Renaissance humanism encouraged a return to original sources and a more critical look at history, some scholars started to question the entire narrative. The big giveaway that diminished the plausibility of a female pope turned out to be the fact that her story wasn't recorded at all in contemporaneous records. One early skeptic was Vatican librarian Bartolomeo Platina, who compiled Lives of the Popes in 1479. He included Joan in his list of popes, but ultimately concluded the story wasn't credible given the chronological impossibilities, rather than the underlying story itself. In essence, the time period where she was said to have been pope had been clearly accounted for. It was really in the 16th century, however, that Pope Joan became the subject of fierce debate. The timing is no coincidence. This was the era of the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. The legend was dragged into confessional conflicts. Protestant writers often seized upon Pope Joan as a handy example of Catholic corruption or error, delighting in the embarrassment the story caused for Rome. At the same time, Catholic scholars worked to refute the tale and defend the unbroken maleness of the papacy. According to the Counter-Reformation scholars, the chronology was airtight. Leo IV died in July 855, and Benedict III was elected in the same year and confirmed by September. According to this narrative, records like Benedict's charter of October 855 and correspondence from that year all exist, so there's no space where an unrecorded Pope Joan could fit. That said, many Protestant scholars suggested that records of Pope Joan had been destroyed, and the records cited were forgeries to maintain the integrity of the Church. After all, the Church didn't have an official problem with the historical reality of Pope Joan as late as the 15th century. Only when Protestantism became an existential crisis for the Church did Joan become a real issue. All that said, by the 18th century, most historians had come to agree that Pope Joan likely never existed, even putting aside the possibility of forgeries, and there's good reasons for this. Today, historians largely consider Pope Joan a legendary figure rather than a real one, and the story is studied as an example of how medieval legends can emerge and evolve. No contemporaneous medieval document whatsoever corroborates the existence of a female pope in the 800s or at any other time. Not a single chronicle, letter, or record from the supposed era of Joan mentions such an astonishing event, a fact which would be virtually impossible if it had truly occurred. Further, even the fiercest enemies of the papacy in earlier eras never mention a female pope, though it would have been the perfect ammunition to attack Rome. There are no records of Eastern Orthodox sources mentioning Pope Joan after the Great Schism, a fact that historians believe would have been mentioned. Likewise, there are no records to indicate proto-Protestant groups like the Cathars and the Waldensians made any mentions of a female pope. Further yet, despite having clashed with the Islamic world extensively during this period, there are no Muslim sources discussing a woman leading the Catholic Church. In essence, the silence of all sources until the 13th century is the ultimate red flag that Joan was not a real historical person. Even after rigorous historical analysis has debunked Pope Joan, her story has proven remarkably enduring, and there are a few reasons for this. Most importantly, the tale is simply too sensational and intriguing to forget. It's the story of a secret female pope who rises to the position through her sheer brilliance, followed by a shocking revelation and downfall. These are elements of high drama that appeal to human curiosity. In terms of storytelling, it hits the marks of a classic folktale or legend, which helped it spread by word of mouth and point of pen alike. The story served both symbolic and educational purposes for a wide variety of audiences, all of whom could interpret it in a way that suited them. In the Middle Ages, it could be read as a moral lesson about deception, or even as a comment on the state of the church. Still, another interpretation that has kept the story alive in modern times is who Pope Joan was supposed to be. According to the most popular telling of the tale, she was much more brilliant than any of her male counterparts, and achieved the position of Pope entirely on her merits. In this way, her story could be reinterpreted as a tale of both empowerment and oppression in a much less enlightened time. On a quiet Sunday in May 1982, a teenager riding his lawnmower along a country road in southwest Ohio made a horrific discovery. It was the body of a man lying in a ditch, and he had been stripped down with signs that he had been beaten. This is the story of Perman Gilbert, a small-town true crime mystery that remains as baffling today as it was in 1982. Gilbert was a lifelong resident of rural southern Ohio, known as a devoted family man and a skilled handyman. He was married to his wife Joanne, and the couple had 4 children, with whom they lived on a farm near the village of Hammersville. The Gilberts were active in their church and community, and Perman had a reputation for being friendly, honest, and dependable. During the week, he worked as an appliance repair technician for a national company, and on Saturdays he took on independent service calls to earn extra income. One of Perman's passions was flying. He owned a small private plane and even maintained a makeshift landing strip on his property, taking to the skies whenever he could. And trust me when I say it, this is going to be important, so keep this in mind. By all appearances, Perman Gilbert's life was stable and lawful. Friends and family later stressed that he didn't engage in risky behavior or have obvious enemies. He was in many ways a regular, well-liked guy in a tiny town. Perman was also very close to his siblings, particularly his youngest brother, Vernon. Vernon Gilbert was 12 years younger and had gotten into trouble with the law on occasion, but Perman remained a supportive older brother. This familial loyalty would later become one angle that investigators examined when searching for a motive in this case. However, in general, nothing about Perman's background hinted at the kind of danger or criminal entanglements that would explain a violent slaying. Saturday, May 22, 1982, started out unremarkably for Perman Gilbert. He left home around 8:30 a.m. to spend the day making appliance repair calls, as he often did on weekends. Uncharacteristically, Perman had told Joanne that morning that he didn't want to go to work that day, a comment he didn't explain, but one that would later haunt his wife. Nonetheless, he set out on his route, which took him through several small Ohio towns to meet scheduled customers and fix their appliances. By around midday, with his jobs completed, Perman crossed the Simon Kenton Bridge over the Ohio River into Maysville, Kentucky, apparently to run a few errands before going home. In Maysville, Perman was spotted at a local supermarket sometime around noon. He bought a pack of Cancer kazoos and chatted with the cashier, who later remembered Perman as his usual upbeat self. After leaving the grocery store, he walked next door to the flower shop and had a brief exchange that would later puzzle investigators. Perman asked the clerk, Donna Phipps, if a certain female employee was working that day. Donna told him that the person wasn't due in until 4 p.m. and offered to help him herself, but Perman declined. He said he wanted to order flowers and that the other employee, quote, knew what he wanted, so he would come back later. While the interaction was odd, nothing about Perman's demeanor seemed normal to the florist, and with that, he exited the shop. That fateful stop at the flower store was the last confirmed sighting of Perman Gilbert alive. Perman never made it home that afternoon, and he had told Joanne to expect him by 3 p.m., But that time came and went with no sign of him. By nightfall, worry began to set in, but Gilbert's family didn't immediately drive around looking for him. Joanne was alone with their youngest child and felt uneasy about venturing out in the dark, but she did begin phoning friends to ask if anyone had seen Perman. When midnight passed with no word, Joanne's fear spiked. Around 3 a.m., in the early hours of Sunday, May 23rd, she called the police to report her husband missing. There was little officers could do in the middle of the night, but they took the report. Friends and family could only wait anxiously as dawn broke, hoping Perman might turn up or call. Unfortunately, the next news they got was every family's worst nightmare. On the afternoon of May 23rd, roughly 36 hours after Perman was last seen, a teenager returning from lawn mowing came upon a ghastly scene on Swope Road in Clermont County. The teen spotted a man's body lying in a ditch alongside the road, and he raced off to get help. Police arriving at the rural location found that the victim had been beaten viciously and shot twice in the chest. Investigators noted some peculiar details about the state of the remains. There were no cloth fibers or remnants of clothing on the upper body or in the bullet wounds, indicating that Perman hadn't been wearing a shirt when he was shot. In fact, his body had been stripped of all clothing and personal effects. His wallet, his wristwatch, his tan cowboy boots, and the large personalized belt buckle he always wore were all gone. Whoever ended him had taken pains to remove anything that might quickly identify him or trace back to his life. Some speculated that leaving the victim in such a state was meant to humiliate the family. The autopsy would later reveal another chilling detail. Perman likely died no more than 10 hours before he was found, placing the time of death on Sunday morning. In other words, he may have been alive through Saturday night, held captive or in the company of the perpetrators for many hours before they finally executed him. In the days following the incident, authorities searched for Perman's missing vehicle. It turned up several days later, abandoned on an out-of-the-way gravel stretch of Ebenezer Road in neighboring Adams County. This was about 20 miles from where Perman's body had been dumped. Inside the van, nothing obvious was amiss, and his toolbox, spare parts, and supplies were still there. They did find unknown fingerprints and some unknown hair, which they thought may be left by the perp, but this couldn't be traced back to anyone at the time. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find out if this hair was preserved for later forensic testing. In the absence of immediate suspects or obvious motive, detectives began piecing together any clues from Perman's life that might explain why he was targeted. Early on, the investigation revolved around three main theories, each pointing to a very different potential motive. One line of inquiry involved Perman's side hobby of aviation, and a suspicious proposition he had reportedly received not long before his death. According to Joanne Gilbert, her husband had confided that some unsavory individuals approached him about using his plane to transport street pharmaceuticals. According to her, Perman flatly refused to get involved in anything illegal and was quite offended that they would even come to him with such an offer. In fact, he told his wife that he had threatened to call the authorities if those people kept bothering him about flying secret cargo. This raised a dark possibility that local traffickers had decided to eliminate Perman because he wouldn't play along. Perhaps they feared he would report them, or they wanted to make an example of someone who said no. However, despite this plausible motive, investigators could never find concrete evidence linking Perman's death to such an operation. A second theory centered on Perman's younger brother Vernon, and the possibility that Perman became entangled in something much bigger than himself. As I mentioned in the beginning of this segment, he was very close to Vernon. 3 months before the slaying, in February 1982, Vernon Gilbert had agreed to testify before a federal grand jury in Cincinnati. The The twist was, he was a witness in an organized crime investigation. The proceedings were closed to the public, but Perman went with his brother to support him. He had to wait outside the courtroom during the grand jury proceedings since these are closed to the public. And for reasons that are about to become obvious, and to tip my own hand more than a little bit, I think this theory offers by far the best explanation of what happened. During those tense hours, Perman grew uneasy, and he later told friends that he felt he was being watched or followed by an unknown man around the courthouse. This retrospective recollection became highly significant after Perman's slaying. One hypothesis was that a criminal organization got wind of Vernon's cooperation with law enforcement and decided to send a deadly message. Perhaps mob-linked figures identified Perman at the courthouse and marked the Gilbert family for retribution. This could explain the humiliating condition his body was left in as well. An even more chilling idea is that they eliminated Perman simply to bait Vernon out. Vernon was in hiding due to his status as a witness against these organized crime figures. Under this theory, they may have hoped that Vernon would attend his brother's funeral and then use this as an opportunity to track him. If this was the plan, it failed, since Vernon didn't end up attending the funeral, precisely because he was warned by the authorities about this potential plan to draw him out. The third major theory put forward that the motive was personal, an illicit affair or jealous rage that led to the slaying. Perman's work often brought him into people's homes, sometimes when only a housewife or female family member was there. Some speculated that the charismatic handyman may have been laying pipe in addition to repairing piping. His stop at the flower shop in Maysville, specifically asking for a particular female employee, made some wonder if he was planning to send flowers to a secret lover. One rumor that circulated was that a jealous husband or boyfriend discovered Perman was seeing this woman and eliminated him. It's the kind of salacious theory that spreads quickly in a small town, but ultimately, there was no evidence to suggest this was the case. The cops thoroughly investigated this angle and found no evidence whatsoever that he was having an affair. By all accounts, Perman wasn't a handyman Casanova, and if he was laying down any pipe, it was in the literal rather than the figurative sense. To this day, no suspects have ever been officially named, and Perman Gilbert's family continues to hold out hope this mystery will one day be solved. Personally, though, I strongly suspect that this is organized crime related, and that there will unfortunately be no justice here at any point. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a reminder to like and subscribe, and also click the share button and spread the love. Also, check out the podcast Lazy Chill True Crime by clicking the links in the description and following over there as well. Early one summer morning in 2009, on the quiet shores of Ross's Point Beach in northwest Ireland, a father and son on a jog made a chilling discovery. It was the body of a middle-aged man laying motionless on the sand. The man had no identification whatsoever, no wallet, no papers, and even the labels in his clothing had been carefully cut out, leaving no clues to his identity. Irish authorities arrived and quickly realized they had a baffling mystery on their hands. In most cases, when an unidentified person is found deceased, police eventually find solid clues to figure out who they are and notify relatives. Not so for the man who called himself Peter Bergman. Detectives soon discovered that a few days earlier, on June 12th, this unknown individual had checked into a Sligo hotel under that alias. He paid in cash and listed a fake address in Vienna, Austria. He was described as being in his late 50s with short gray hair and a thick German accent, neatly dressed and very polite. In fact, showing identification was supposed to be part of the check-in process, but Peter Bergman looked like a polite, upstanding individual, so this just flat out didn't happen. Investigators later pieced together much of the man's final days in Sligo using surveillance footage and witness statements. On Friday, June 12th, 2009, the unidentified man arrived in Sligo by bus from Derry in Northern Ireland. He took a taxi from the station and checked into the Sligo City Hotel for a 3-night stay, paying up front in cash. Using his alias, he gave a false Vienna address and was not asked for identification. Hotel staff noted that he had a German accent and kept to himself. And as any Simpsons fan knows, no one who speaks German could be a bad man. So obviously, there was no reason to do their due diligence. Over the next 3 days, Bergman maintained a low profile, but engaged in some curious behavior. Each day, hotel surveillance cameras caught him leaving with a purple plastic bag filled with unknown items and returning with it empty. Investigators believe he was gradually dumping his personal belongings in trash bins all around Sligo, carefully using different locations to ensure nothing would be recovered. He seemed to deliberately avoid surveillance when disposing of things, suggesting a well-planned effort to erase his past. On Saturday, June 13th, he visited the local post office to purchase airmail stamps. It's presumed he mailed out letters, perhaps final messages to someone, but if so, those letters have never been traced by police. That weekend, he was occasionally seen stepping out for a smoke or a meal alone, always polite but extremely distant. On Sunday, June 14th, the man took a taxi to Ross's Point, the scenic beach outside town, where his life would soon end. He asked the driver for a good place to swim, and at the beach, he got out, looked around briefly, then oddly decided to head straight back to town in the same taxi. It was as if he was scouting the beach for what he planned to do next. Monday, June 15th, was the mysterious stranger's last day alive. Shortly after 1 p.m., he checked out of the hotel, carrying only a black shoulder bag, his purple plastic bag, and a new medium-sized black suitcase. The small carry-on bag he'd arrived with was no longer with him, implying he had disposed of it somewhere throughout his stay. From the hotel, he walked to the bus station, and there, he bought a coffee and a snack, and was observed reading some notes on small scraps of paper. He then tore them up and threw the pieces into a garbage bin. Whatever information he wrote down, he clearly didn't want anyone else to see it, and these scraps were unsurprisingly never recovered. That afternoon, the man boarded a bus to Ross's Point Beach once again. Several beachgoers later remembered seeing him walking along the sand that day, a tall, gray-haired man in a dark jacket, politely greeting passers-by. He didn't seem distressed, and if anything, it was the exact opposite, like he had found some sort of profound peace. Witnesses recalled him smiling and nodding hello as he strolled the shore, looking generally upbeat. As evening fell and the beach emptied, he was last seen alive at approximately midnight, still alone by the water's edge. By the following dawn, the man only known as Peter Bergman was no longer amongst the realm of the living. At 6:45 a.m. on Tuesday, June 16, 2009, a local man and his son were jogging along Ross's Point when they found a body lying near the water's edge. It was the same stranger who had been seen around town, now deceased. He was dressed for a swim, wearing only beach attire, and some of his clothing was found on the shore, but there were no identification documents anywhere. Police noted that even the tags in his clothes had been cut out to conceal any origin clues. The man was officially pronounced dead at the scene, and the Irish police launched an intensive investigation to find out who he was and how he died. A post-mortem examination yielded more surprises. Despite his fit appearance in life, the man was in very poor health. He had advanced prostate cancer and multiple bone tumors, as well as signs of past heart problems. Yet, Remarkably, toxicology tests found no trace of any medication in his system. He wasn't even taking painkillers, despite what must have been severe pain from his chronic conditions. As for his likely cause of death, it's not what you think, and I don't have to use some euphemism like unalived to talk about what happened next. The pathologist noted that there was no classic evidence of drowning in his lungs or airways. He had likely succumbed to cardiac arrest while entering into the cold sea or while on the shore of the beach. There were absolutely no signs of foul play or trauma. Investigators worked diligently to identify the dead man. They ran his fingerprints and DNA through international databases with no matches. They checked missing persons reports across Europe and beyond, but found nothing that fit his description. The address he had given at the hotel was as phony as his name, and after a 5-month investigation, authorities had the unknown man laid to rest in Sligo in an unmarked grave. In the end, the man who had gone to such pains to hide his identity succeeded, and he remained a mystery. Over the years, various theories have emerged to explain the enigma of Peter Bergman. Some are sensible, others quite far-fetched. The leading theory is that the man was terminally ill and chose to perish in a place where no one knew him. Knowing he didn't have long to live, he may have decided to slip away quietly, rather than letting his friends and family see his final painful days. The beautiful, secluded coast of Sligo could have seemed like a fitting spot for his final moments. In this scenario, every step he took, including disposing of his belongings and removing all labels, was to ensure that his death would leave no trail back to his past life. Perhaps he even hoped his body would drift out to sea and never be found, fully completing his disappearance. Another theory is that Peter Bergman was hiding from something or someone. The use of an alias, the deliberate erasing of his traces, and the secretive behavior suggest to some that he might have been a fugitive or a former spy trying to escape detection. This idea is, of course, extremely interesting, but there's just really nothing to suggest it whatsoever beyond the fact that his behavior was unusual. Peter Bergman is no Isdal woman, and the circumstances seem to suggest that this cowboy wasn't running from anyone other than himself. Even more outlandish speculations have also been floated, reflecting how baffling this case is. Some amateur sleuths pointed out his careful tactics and wondered if he had a military or law enforcement background. One particularly bizarre claim even suggested the entire case was a hoax, orchestrated by a filmmaker as a piece of performance art. In truth, no evidence has ever emerged for any of these exotic theories. My personal theory is that the man who used the name Peter Bergman deliberately engineered his disappearance, but he didn't want to leave those he cared about uninformed. The sequence of documented actions feels like the work of someone conducting a tidy, intentional exit after a period of pain and suffering. Those measures show planning and a desire to control the manner in which he would be known or unknown. They read to me as deliberate acts meant to separate the public facts of his death from the private communications he still intended to make. If he did send letters, as the purchase of airmail stamps suggests, those envelopes would serve as his chosen mechanism for confidential contact. Airmail implies international destinations, and the possibility that he wanted to reach people who lived far away without creating an electronic trail. Mailing handwritten messages would let him speak directly to selected recipients while avoiding traceable phone calls, emails, or digital footprints. The simultaneous act of shredding or tearing other notes in public fits a pattern. He wanted certain words to travel and everything else to be irretrievable. In short, he could have ensured that only those he trusted received explanation or farewell, while the wider world saw only a man with no identity. The puzzle of public silence, despite significant media coverage, becomes less mystifying on this reading. If the people who knew him had already been told and had agreed to honor his wishes, they might have chosen privacy over publicity. Thus, the absence of public identification doesn't necessarily mean no one knew him. It may actually mean the opposite, that those who knew him very well and chose to respect his wishes. At 9:30 on the morning of August 1st, 2012, the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange signaled the start of a normal trading day. But for Knight Capital, it was the start of a nightmare, so to speak. Knight was one of Wall Street's top market makers, handling roughly 17% of all American stock trading volume at the time. But first, let me take a moment to do a quick aside on what a market maker is and why they accounted for such a large portion of volume. A market maker is a company, or technically even a person, that's always ready to buy and sell a stock so other people can trade quickly. They make money from the small difference between the price they buy at and the price they sell at, while keeping the market moving smoothly. Market makers profit by buying a stock at a slightly lower price and then selling it at a slightly higher price, pocketing the difference called the spread. Because they trade absolutely huge volumes of shares every day, even tiny spreads add up to big profits over the course of a year. Further, because they conduct so many trades so rapidly, they rely on algorithms to conduct these transactions. With that said, let's get down to how this incident occurred. On that fateful Wednesday morning, Knight Capital's systems went on a buying spree. The firm's algorithms unexpectedly started flooding the market with orders across a broad range of stocks. In the span of roughly half an hour, Knight accumulated positions in 154 different stocks, totaling about 397 million shares. The automated programs didn't just buy, they bought and sold repeatedly at rapid-fire speeds, ignoring normal trading limits. Stocks that Knight normally helped make markets in were suddenly whipsawing in price due to the sheer volume of erroneous trades. By the time Knight's team realized the extent of the problem, the company had unintentionally acquired around $7 billion worth of securities. These positions were unplanned, a massive inventory of overpriced stocks that no one at Knight actually intended to buy. The firm was now stuck holding huge long positions in some stocks and short positions in others, all accumulated by accident. As the losses mounted with each unintended trade, Knight's management scrambled to contain the damage. It took 45 frantic minutes before Knight Capital finally hit the switch and shut down its trading to stop the bleeding, but by then, the damage was done. The firm's unplanned stock positions had to be unwound as quickly as possible to avoid even greater losses. Knight frantically sold off the trove of stocks it never meant to own. This was a task so large that Goldman Sachs stepped in to buy the entire pile of unwanted shares by the end of the day, but at a massive discount. Unloading that inventory came at a high price, and Knight ultimately lost around $440 million when the dust settled. In mere minutes, a glitch had pushed a powerhouse trading firm to the brink of bankruptcy. The story behind Knight's glitch turned out to be a perfect storm of lack of oversight, poor management, rushed changes, and failed safety checks. Investigators and insiders pieced together the chain of events that led to the disaster. A retired trading feature called PowerPeg had been dormant in Knight's software since 2001, but its code was never fully removed. And yeah, there's more than a little bit of humor in the name of that trading feature in my view. In 2012, Knight repurposed the old features of the algorithm, unknowingly reactivating some of the PowerPeg logic in unintentional ways. I suppose you could even say that the algorithm appears to have been unintentionally set to pegging Knight Capital, but I'll come back to intentionality in a moment. Knight's team rolled out the new software, but one of its servers failed to update and continued running the obsolete code. This out-of-sync server was a ticking time bomb within the system. When the market opened, the rogue server started generating massive erroneous orders based on the old logic. Transactions multiplied uncontrollably. Millions of shares were bought and sold within minutes, since the usual volume caps and fail-safes had been bypassed. The immediate aftermath of the Knight Capital glitch was as chaotic as the event itself. News of the incident spread fast, and Knight's stock price plunged by nearly 50% in a single day. On the verge of collapse, Knight was forced to seek an emergency lifeline. Just days later, a group of firms poured about $400 million into Knight to stabilize it, since the removal of this firm from the playing board would decrease market liquidity big time. This rescue kept Knight Capital afloat, but at a steep cost. The new investors took a majority ownership stake at a fire sale price, diluting existing shareholders. Knight had essentially saved itself by selling itself off in pieces. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched an investigation and later fined Knight Capital $12 million for failing to have adequate risk controls. According to the SEC, Knight violated the market access rule, which requires brokers to have safeguards to prevent these kinds of trading disasters. The SEC's report made it clear that Knight's systems lacked the basic checks that could have stopped the avalanche of bad trades. For Knight Capital itself, there was no returning to business as usual. The firm limped on for only a few months with its reputation and capital badly damaged before it was fully taken over by one of the firms that had come to the rescue. Whenever a disaster of this scale happens, people naturally wonder if there is more to the story. Knight's 2012 glitch was officially attributed to a series of mistakes and bad luck, a perfect storm of human error. But in the aftermath, some observers floated theories that the event might not have been entirely accidental. Some have speculated that the error in the code was intentionally placed there, perhaps by a competitor, in a cloak-and-dagger act of sabotage. Others have speculated that the error may have been inserted by a disgruntled employee or contractor to bring down this massive firm. More outlandish theories even suggest that the firm was taken out by a state actor, though the reasoning for this is unclear. These theories have essentially gained significant traction because they're interesting. However, the intentional glitch theory remains firmly in the realm of speculation. Most experts agree that Knight's own internal errors lit the fuse, and once the bomb went off, natural market forces did the rest. In essence, the real mystery is why there were no meaningful safeguards to prevent this event, a question which will likely never be answered. Imagine living in a time when money itself seemed to disappear from the face of the earth. In the mid-15th century, Europe experienced a severe shortage of precious metals so extreme that historians call it the Great Bullion Famine. Coins were the lifeblood of the medieval economy and were the basis for both trade and taxes. And unlike today, when central banks can simply print fiat currency, medieval governments had no such option. When the silver and gold ran out, so did the money supply. As these resources grew scarce, markets faltered, wages went unpaid in real currency, and everyone from merchants to kings found their treasuries running dry. The bullion famine was the result of a perfect storm of economic imbalance, geopolitical turmoil, and technological limits. One major factor was Europe's trade deficit with the Eastern world. Late medieval Europeans had a voracious appetite for spices, silk, and other luxuries from the Middle East and Asia. To pay for these imports, Western merchants sent huge quantities of silver coin eastward. Over time, bullion flowed out of Europe faster than it came in. This might have been sustainable if European mines could ramp up production to replace the lost silver and gold, But by the 1400s, many of those mines were in decline. Easily accessible veins were exhausted, and miners struggled to dig deeper with the era's limited technology. The famous silver mines of Bohemia, for example, produced only a fraction of their former output by the 15th century. Plague, various conflicts, and loss of territory to outside powers compounded the problem. The Black Plague in the 14th century had devastated Europe's population, including the mining workforce. Then ongoing conflicts, like the Hundred Years' War in Western Europe and conflicts in the Balkans, disrupted trade and drained treasuries. In the east, the expanding Ottoman Empire seized control of rich Balkan silver mines, cutting off a source that once fed European mints. Even the stream of gold from West Africa, once brought into Europe via trans-Saharan trade routes, had dwindled by the 15th century, removing another traditional source of bullion. By the 1450s, Europe was at the height of the squeeze. More silver was leaving than could be replaced, and gold was equally scarce. People at the time grasped for explanations. Many blamed hoarding, the idea that merchants were hiding away coins and not spending them. Indeed, uncertainty may have led some to stuff their coffers. But hoarding was only a minor piece of the puzzle. The real roots of the crisis lay in those bigger forces, a continent spending its money abroad while its mines ran dry amid plague and conflict. The bullion famine had dramatic consequences for trade, labor, and governance. Commerce slowed to a crawl due to this lack of cash. Without enough silver and gold currency in circulation, buying and selling became difficult, and more transactions resorted to inefficient barter systems. The crisis also hit the workforce. Employers found it hard to pay wages in real money, and workers grew frustrated receiving pay in kind, such as food or cloth. In England, it became so bad that in 1464, King Edward IV decreed cloth workers must be paid in, quote, true and lawful money, rather than in goods. Even so, complaints continued, since often there was simply no silver available to pay artisans and laborers. Many people effectively fell back into a barter economy for daily life. Governments struggled to function as their treasuries thinned. Kingdoms needed coins to pay soldiers, equip ships, and administer justice. As bullion dried up, mints from England to Florence slowed or halted production. Some rulers resorted to debasement, the process of mixing less precious metal into coins to stretch the supply. This tactic allowed more coins to be minted from the same bullion, but it led to inflation and public distrust, since each coin contained less precious metal. By the mid-15th century, much of Europe was mired in an economic slump, and social unrest flared as communities struggled under the strain. Still, a few financial hubs weathered the storm better than others. For example, the trading cities of the Low Countries used sophisticated credit networks and alternative currencies to keep commerce moving even when silver was scarce. Solving the bullion famine took effort, innovation, and global exploration. One remedy was to boost mining output at home. The urgent need for metal drove technical progress in European mining. By the mid-1400s, miners had introduced new pumps and equipment to dig deeper into exhausted mines. This led to fresh discoveries or better yields in Central Europe, where rich silver veins were tapped in the 1450s and beyond. Those new mines didn't flood the market overnight, but they gradually increased Europe's coin supply and eased the worst shortages. Another remedy was to find bullion abroad. Portugal's explorers played a key role here. Portuguese ships sailed down the West African coast in the 15th century seeking gold. By the 1440s, they began bringing back African gold from trading posts on the Guinea coast. This African gold was a lifeline, allowing mints to strike more coins and keep commerce alive. Further, in 1498, Vasco da Gama's expedition opened a sea route to India. This gave Europeans direct access to Asian markets and reduced the need to pay for Eastern goods with Europe's remaining silver by cutting out most of the people in the middle. The most dramatic turning point came with the Age of Discovery. The search for precious metals, amongst other goods, drove explorers like Christopher Columbus to venture across the Atlantic. Columbus's 1492 voyage, though intended to find Asia, led to the European encounter with the Americas. Within a few decades, the Spanish were sending shiploads of treasure back home. By the 1530s, silver from rich mines in the Americas was pouring into Europe. This flood of new wealth decisively ended the bullion famine. By the mid-16th century, Europe had a far more plentiful money supply than before, marking the transition to a new economic era. Ironically, Europe then faced yet another problem: bullion-fueled inflation in the 1500s. This crisis left a lasting mark on how Europeans handled money and trade. The scarcity of coin forced people to innovate with credit and banking, helping plant some of the early seeds of capitalism. With not enough metal money to go around, merchants and financiers had to rely more on letters of credit, bills of exchange, and other forms of paper promise. Italian banking houses in places like Florence and Venice were at the forefront of this financial adaptation. They developed sophisticated accounting systems to keep track of transactions without immediate cash, effectively creating money on the books. This wider use of credit and trust helped keep commerce afloat and demonstrated the power of banking networks. On a calm September night in 1989, at a convenience store along a lonely highway in North Florida, 36-year-old Darlene Messer vanished without a trace. 2 days later, a railroad conductor crossing a small bridge made a horrifying discovery. Darlene's crumpled body lay face down in the shallow water below. Her face had been beaten so savagely that identification was nearly impossible, and it was later determined that Darlene had been abducted from her workplace and brutally eliminated. This is the haunting story of what happened to Darlene Messer and the enduring mystery that continues to this day. Darlene was a 36-year-old mother originally from Calgary in Canada. In 1987, she moved to Florida to be near a prison pen pal, Charles Messer, who would soon become her husband. Charles was imprisoned for slaying an individual during a robbery and was actually scheduled to get the big state-sponsored DP. According to those who knew Darlene, she knew about the nature of his criminal offenses, but she had been led to believe that he was going to get paroled. I'm guessing she didn't know too much about Florida justice, but hey, it was the 80s. By that year, Darlene was living in Lake City and working the overnight shift at a convenience store. Her mother was visiting from Canada at the time, completely unaware of the tragedy about to unfold. Late on September 18, 1989, Darlene was behind the counter on her usual graveyard shift. Shortly after midnight, a couple from Georgia stopped in around 12:35 for coffee and snacks. They stayed for about 15 minutes, and as they left, they nearly collided with an incoming vehicle, an older rust-colored Pontiac Grand Prix. This was the last car seen at the store before everything went wrong. At about 12:55 a.m., minutes after that mystery car arrived, the store's silent alarm went off. Police rushed to the scene and found the place empty and chaotic. Around $100 was missing from the register, and money and goods were strewn across the floor, and Darlene was gone. She was packing a Roscoe in her purse, but it appeared that the weapon was simply too far away from her. This suggested that this was a violent and sudden abduction. A frantic search began for the missing clerk almost immediately, with her mother attempting to help in any way she could. 2 days later, on September 20th, a train conductor passing over a bridge about 13 miles from the store spotted a body in the shallow water below. Authorities found Darlene lying face down in water under the bridge. She was fully clothed but missing one shoe, as well as a necklace and an earring. These are items that were potentially lost in the struggle, or potentially dark souvenirs taken by the predator. She had been beaten, possibly with a hammer, and the blows to her face were so severe she was almost unrecognizable. I don't usually get into the gruesome details, but here it's important since some have suggested that this hints at a personal grudge against Darlene. And keep that in mind, because there were two men who definitely had some serious hatred of her, but I'll get to that in a moment. Evidence on the bridge indicated she was probably eliminated there and her body thrown into the creek afterward. Investigators also noted an oil stain on the bridge, possibly left by the perp's vehicle. Detectives began piecing together leads. The couple who last saw Darlene described the car they encountered, but they couldn't see the driver. 10 days before the slaying, Darlene had reported two suspicious men lurking around the convenience store's parking lot. Police responded and arrested the pair, who were armed. These men, known as Bob and Roger, were former co-workers of Darlene's. She had even reported them for theft at a previous job, suggesting a grudge. When they were arrested, Bob and Roger were driving a rust-colored Grand Prix that leaked oil, eerily similar to the car and clues in Darlene's case. Further, the very personal way in which Darlene was eliminated by the perpetrator or perpetrators does suggest a grudge may have been at play, and Bob and Roger definitely had one. Investigators focused on these two men, and both denied involvement and claimed they were nowhere near Lake City that night. Ultimately, forensic evidence at the scene suggested they weren't solely responsible. That said, the authorities have speculated that they may have had help from another man, explaining why the forensic situation doesn't line up neatly, and they've never been cleared. Another lead pointed to a 31-year-old man arrested in Gainesville for a string of convenience store robberies around that time. A witness had reported seeing a blue car with a woman screaming near Lake City on the night Darlene disappeared, and this suspect drove a blue car. He also had a violent past, and his own wife reportedly made statements implicating him. Police impounded his vehicle, but found nothing to tie him to Darlene's abduction. Given Darlene's unusual personal life, detectives considered her husband as well. Charles Messer was in prison at the time, and some speculated he orchestrated an attack from prison out of jealousy. This theory never gained traction, and police found no evidence for it, and believed Charles had no role in his wife's death. Others have speculated that her connection to Messer may have made her a target. Under this line of reasoning, she may have been targeted by someone who Messer wronged, either in his criminal career or inside prison. Ultimately, however, there's no proof of this, despite how intriguing the theory may be. Three little girls went on what appeared to be a camping trip with their dad, but in a disturbing twist, they never came home. That father's three young daughters were found deceased at a remote campground in Washington's Cascade Mountains, and the father himself missing. In early June 2025, authorities in Washington state discovered the bodies of 9-year-old Peyton, 8-year-old Evelyn, and 5-year-old Olivia Decker. They were found near the Rock Island campground in the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest. The girls had been reported missing 3 days earlier after their father, 32-year-old Travis Decker, failed to return them to their mother following a court-ordered visitation. A sheriff's deputy searching the area made the grim find. The sisters were in and around Decker's parked pickup truck, their small wrists bound with zip ties and plastic bags tied over their heads. This horrific scene left no doubt what had happened, and investigators quickly determined the man responsible was their father. The discovery of the children's bodies immediately set off an intensive manhunt for their missing father. Decker, an Army veteran with survival training, was nowhere to be found at the campsite. His white truck was abandoned at the scene, and scattered nearby were disturbing clues. There were remnants of plastic bags and zip ties, and what appeared to be bloody handprints on the truck's tailgate. Travis Decker had been a familiar presence in his daughters' lives. He was an Army veteran, but in civilian life he struggled with severe post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health issues. Family accounts described him waking from nightmares and barely sleeping due to this trauma. These struggles strained his 10-year marriage to Whitney Decker, which ended in 2022. Afterward, Whitney was granted full custody of the girls due to the instability of the father. Given concerns about Travis's mental stability, a court restricted his parenting time to short daytime visits in the Wenatchee area with no overnight stays. He was supposed to seek counseling and undergo a psychiatric evaluation, conditions he did not fulfill. Despite his personal decline, by 2025 he was effectively homeless and unemployed. Everyone believed he was loved and adored his children. No one imagined that the scheduled visitation on May 30th, 2025 would end in unspeakable tragedy. In fact, just 3 days before the girls went missing, Decker had been involved in a minor car accident and was cited by police. Records indicated that his behavior was odd and belligerent during this time. He was also noted to be behaving unusually at work in the weeks prior to the event. These were small incidents that in hindsight foreshadowed the extreme turmoil to come. On May 30th, 2025, Travis Decker picked up Peyton, Evelyn, and Olivia from their mother for what was supposed to be a routine visit. He even told his ex-wife he would have the girls home by 8 that evening. But that night, he never showed up, and Whitney Decker's calls to him went straight to voicemail. By late evening, she contacted police, alarmed that Travis had disappeared with the children. Over the next 2 days, authorities treated the situation as an endangered missing persons case. Travis had no fixed residence and could have taken the girls to any campground or motel. An alert was broadcast statewide, and police and family frantically searched for the trio. In hindsight, evidence suggests Travis may have been planning an escape. Investigators later discovered that just days before the slayings, he had Googled how to move to Canada. Whether he intended to flee with the girls or alone remains unknown, but the timing of those searches hints at premeditation. On June 2nd, 2025, the mystery turned into horror. That afternoon, deputies found Decker's pickup truck parked at a remote campsite near Leavenworth, and near it they discovered the bodies of Peyton, Evelyn, and Olivia. For law enforcement, finding Travis Decker became a daunting challenge. As a former soldier with survival skills, he was believed capable of living off the land for an extended time. The area around the campground is remote and rugged. Steep mountain foothills blanketed in dense forest, where a person could easily slip out of sight. Within days of the slayings, a multi-agency manhunt mobilized. The Chelan County Sheriff's Office coordinated with the FBI, the Marshal Service, the Washington State Patrol, and other local agencies to scour the wilderness for any sign of Decker. Teams used tracking dogs and cadaver dogs to sniff through the woods, while helicopters and drones scanned from above. Ground searchers trekked through thick brush, along riverbanks, and up ravines, contending with dangerous terrain and scant cell phone service. Authorities circulated wanted posters with Decker's photo widely in the area where he might be. They also released digitally altered images, showing how he might change his appearance by shaving his head or beard to avoid recognition. In the first week, a few leads emerged but ultimately led nowhere. A reported sighting of Decker in Idaho on June 4th was investigated and quickly written off as a case of mistaken identity. Search teams at one point found footprints and other indications in the Blewett Pass area of Washington, but those clues didn't result in a capture. Frustratingly, every promising trail seemed to go cold. As the manhunt stretched into late summer, authorities intensified their efforts near the scene of the crime. On August 25, 2025, the FBI led a large-scale operation to re-sweep the vicinity of Rock Island Campground with fresh resources. About 100 personnel, including FBI agents, tactical teams, and forensic specialists, conducted a meticulous grid search of a quarter-mile radius around the campground. Trails and campsites were temporarily closed to the public as searchers bushwhacked through undergrowth. Despite this exhaustive two-day effort, no trace of Decker was found. Officials stressed that there had been no break in the case, and they still had no evidence indicating whether Decker is alive or dead. One sheriff noted that if Decker is out there, he has to remain lucky every single day, whereas the authorities only have to be successful once to finally catch him. In other words, one mistake by the fugitive, or one lucky break for authorities, could finally end the manhunt. Not all experts believe Decker can evade capture indefinitely. One law enforcement analyst pointed out that since search dogs haven't picked up any scent of a body, this suggests he likely hasn't died in the woods. This expert believes Decker is probably still on the move and will eventually have to come out of hiding to seek shelter or food. According to this theory, given the national attention on the case, at that point he's most vulnerable to being taken into custody. On the other hand, investigators cannot rule out that Decker somehow slipped out of the region entirely. Decker had been researching how to get into Canada, and many speculate he may be holed up in the Great White North as we speak. Security is extremely lax along this border, and large stretches are essentially minimally patrolled tracts of vast wilderness. He may be hiding out in the interior of the province of British Columbia, or he may be making for the truly wild north. Some have speculated that he could be planning on setting up an outpost in the Yukon Territory or the Northwest Territories. To put this in perspective, the Yukon and the Northwest Territories combined are almost triple the size of Texas and are virtually unpopulated. At present, the manhunt for Travis Decker remains ongoing. If you have any information about this active and ongoing investigation, please contact the U.S. Marshal Service or the FBI or the local sheriff's office. The authorities have warned anyone who sees this man not to approach him or attempt to apprehend him, as he is considered armed and extremely dangerous. Personally, I have some serious doubts that this guy is alive after he fully processed the profoundly evil acts he committed against the three people who loved and trusted him most. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a reminder to like and subscribe, and also click the share button and spread the love. Also, I've just launched the Lazy Chill History podcast, where I'm slowly rolling out all my content from my history channel. I've included the link in the description, so do me a huge favor and check it out and follow me over there as well. On a cold December afternoon in 1992, 23-year-old Stephen Clark walked into a public washroom by the seaside and was never seen again. The quaint coastal village of Marske by the Sea in northern England would become the center of a decades-long mystery after Stephen vanished without a trace. What began as a routine holiday walk with his mother turned into one of the UK's most perplexing missing person cases. Over 30 years later, Stephen's fate remains unknown, leaving his family and an entire community desperate for answers. Stephen Clark was born in 1969 and grew up in a loving family alongside his parents, Doris and Charles, and a younger sister, Victoria. As a child, he survived a terrible accident where he was struck by a vehicle, an event that left him with serious injuries to his left arm and leg. The damage was permanent. Stephen's left arm was largely unusable, and he walked with a pronounced limp for the rest of his life. Despite the challenges stemming from his childhood injuries, Stephen was determined to build an independent life. In his late teens, his family had spent several years in South Africa before returning to England in 1990, eventually settling in Marsk by the Sea. Eager to improve his prospects, he enrolled in a training program with an organization supporting people with disabilities in developing job skills. During this time, Stephen also began dating a young woman he met through the program. He grew close enough to be invited to her home to meet her parents, a sign that the relationship was becoming meaningful. By the winter of 1992, it seemed that Stephen was on the verge of big things in both his personal and professional life. As Christmas came and went that year, none of his loved ones could have imagined that Stephen's promising life was about to take a tragic turn. The incident occurred on Monday, December 28, 1992, just after Christmas. Stephen and his mother Doris decided to take an afternoon walk along the beach from their village of Marsk to the nearby town of Saltburn by the sea. The seaside promenade was a familiar spot and an easy outing for the 23-year-old and his mom. At approximately 3 o'clock that afternoon, as they strolled near Saltburn's pier, Stephen told his mother he needed to use the washroom. He headed for the public toilet while Doris went into the adjacent ladies' facilities at the same time. That brief moment, a mother and son entering separate bathrooms, would be the last time Doris ever saw her son. Stephen had vanished in a matter of minutes, in a busy area, with no witnesses whatsoever. Alarmed and confused, Doris searched the immediate area but found no sign of Stephen. It was as if he had evaporated into thin air. When he failed to turn up, Stephen's family contacted police to report him missing. The initial search for Stephen focused on the coastline and town where he was last seen. Given the proximity to the sea, there was concern he might have had an accident, perhaps fallen from the nearby pier or cliffs, or been caught by the tide. However, extensive searches of the shoreline and surrounding area turned up nothing. No clothing, no clues, and, most importantly, no body was ever found. Stephen seemed to have disappeared without a trace, leaving behind countless unanswered questions. Adding to the mystery, it was later noted that Stephen had left some personal items back home that day, including his wallet, watch, and glasses. These are items he would almost certainly need if he planned on going anywhere for long. These possessions sitting untouched in his bedroom suggested that he fully expected to return home shortly, a return that never happened. For years, the last confirmed sighting of Stephen remained that fateful moment at the Saltburn public toilets. His family was left in limbo, and Doris and Charles insisted their son was happy and had no reason to run away. The idea that he might have done something or simply left to start a new life didn't square with his personality or circumstances. Stephen had been looking forward to things like a potential job opportunity and his budding romance, making a voluntary disappearance seem improbable. Still, without any evidence of foul play, police initially treated the case as a missing person inquiry. The trail in Saltburn went cold, and as the 1990s progressed, Stephen's case languished with no breakthroughs. Then, in 2020, this long-dormant case was suddenly thrust back into the spotlight. The cold case unit took a fresh look at the file and uncovered new information that raised disturbing possibilities. In particular, detectives revealed that a potential witness had come forward with a significant new sighting. A woman reported seeing a man she believed to be Stephen near the Clark family's home in Marsk on the very day he went missing. She recalled this as being sometime between 3 and 4 that afternoon, on December 28, 1992. And yeah, that's quite a memory on her, recalling the exact time and date she saw someone almost 30 years ago. I can't even remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. But to spoil what happens next, this is going to be part of the basis for charging the parents, but I'll come to that. If accurate, this sighting meant that Stephen did make it back from Saltburn that afternoon. This would contradict the long-held assumption that whatever happened to him occurred at the seaside toilets. Police stated that they found the report credible and now believe Stephen was alive and in the vicinity of his home during that hour on the day he vanished. This revelation shifted the focus of the investigation dramatically and hinted that the original timeline of events might be incomplete. Even more startling was an old clue resurrected from the past. Back in 1999, 7 years after Stephen disappeared, an anonymous letter had been mailed to the local police station. The unsigned letter claimed that Stephen Clark was dead, and even named a specific person responsible for his death. At the time, officers had logged the letter and discussed its contents with Stephen's family, but with no corroborating evidence, the lead went nowhere and faded into obscurity. Now, with the case reopened, detectives made a public appeal in 2020 for the mystery letter writer to come forward. In a surprising turn, the author of the letter did come forward after that appeal and spoke with police as part of the investigation. Authorities haven't disclosed what was learned, but the letter's emergence was one of several factors that convinced investigators something criminal might have happened to Stephen. By late 2020, the Cold Case Review had gathered enough evidence and suspicion for the authorities to take drastic action. Citing the total absence of any proof of life for nearly 30 years, detectives formally declared that Stephen was likely slain. But then things took a very dramatic and unexpected turn. In September 2020, in a bombshell development that made national headlines in the UK, Stephen's elderly parents, Doris and Charles Clark, were arrested for the crime. The notion that his own mother and father, now in their late 70s, could be implicated in Stephen's fate shocked those who knew the close-knit family. Police spent days searching the Clark home, digging up sections of the yard and combing through decades-old belongings for any hidden evidence. The investigation into Stephen's relationships and last known activities took on new urgency as detectives tried to determine if there had been foul play from within the household. After months of scrutiny, however, the case against Doris and Charles didn't materialize. In early 2021, the Crown Prosecution Service announced no charges would be filed due to insufficient evidence. The Clarks were fully cleared and released, and ultimately it remains unclear why the authorities figured that this would be an appropriate charge in the circumstances. Both parents vehemently maintained their innocence throughout, calling the ordeal horrendous, and professing that they had no idea what happened to Stephen. In fact, in the wake of their arrest, the couple took the unusual step of inviting a television documentary crew into their lives. They hoped that this would both clear their names and also raise the profile of their son's case. They may have also been hoping to put some serious pressure on the authorities to actually crack the case given the spectacle that was created with the arrest. However, by the end of 2021, the active investigation wound down again with no arrests, no answers, and a cloud of suspicion dispelled, but not fully understood. Over the years, Stephen Clark's case has spawned many theories, each troubling in its own way, and none supported by definitive evidence. One early theory was that Stephen might have suffered an accident by the sea, such as slipping on ice or being swept away by waves near the pier. However, an extensive search never found any trace of him along the coast, and the geography of the region isn't particularly treacherous. Another possibility raised was that Stephen chose to disappear intentionally, perhaps to start a new life. Yet those close to him argue this is out of character. and Stephen left behind his essential belongings and also was looking forward to upcoming opportunities. This makes it hard to believe he would simply walk away forever, especially since he seems to have been so excited about his new girlfriend and the potential future with her. There's also the grim scenario of a random attacker or abduction. No witnesses have ever come forward to suggest an attack in that busy area, and Stephen, at 6 feet 3 inches, isn't the sort of person predators generally choose to target. Even though he had a visible physical disability due to the accident, he would have still been able to give a hell of a fight. The most persistent theory, and the one pursued by police in 2020, is that foul play by someone close to Stephen led to his disappearance. Investigators scrutinize Stephen's inner circle, including family, because statistically, a person is often harmed by someone they know. The anonymous letter from 1999 had explicitly pointed to an unnamed individual's involvement, implying that Stephen was slain and the truth covered up. Ultimately, however, at present, all we can say is that his parents have been investigated thoroughly and cleared. As of today, the disappearance of Stephen Clark remains an agonizing, unsolved mystery. It's now been more than 3 decades since that December day, and Stephen's 53rd birthday has come and gone with no answers. His story continues to haunt the community of Marsk by the Sea, where by all accounts he was a familiar and well-liked figure. His parents, against all hope, have publicly stated that they continue to hope that one day he'll simply just walk through the door once again. Imagine walking alone on a misty mountain path in rural Japan. All is quiet until a strange, hunched figure emerges from the trees. Before you can even cry out, the creature speaks, and it's your voice, uttering the very thought that was forming in your mind. Such is the unnerving encounter with the Satori, a mysterious being of Japanese folklore said to read minds. In Japanese lore, the Satori is described as a monkey-like supernatural creature that dwells in remote mountain regions. Travelers trekking along lonely mountain paths, or woodcutters working at isolated forest huts, may encounter a Satori suddenly appearing on the trail. With its hunched, hairy form and unnervingly keen eyes, the creature's mere appearance is frightening, yet the Satori's most dreaded ability is even more unsettling. The hallmark of a Satori is its telepathic power to read human thoughts. It will instantly speak a person's thoughts aloud, often finishing your sentences before you do. This means the creature can anticipate every action. If you plan to run or to strike it, the Satori already knows, making it nearly impossible to catch by surprise. This psychological terror of having one's private thoughts exposed by a monster makes the Satori especially feared. Beyond its mind reading, the Satori is also known as a dangerous predator. Legends claim it will hunt humans for sport. However, folklore offers a clever defense against this menace. If a person can manage to do something truly unexpected, an action with no premeditation, it might startle the Satori and send it fleeing in fear. Better yet, the surefire way to survive a Satori encounter is to empty one's mind completely. With no thoughts to read, the mind-reading monster becomes confused or bored, and eventually wanders off. Of course, achieving such a zen-like state of no mind while facing a hungry cryptid is easier said than done, which is why most victims in the tales are not so lucky. The Satori's very name hints at its eerie role. In Japanese, Satori refers to sudden enlightenment, an ironic title for a wild mountain monster. Even the prescribed escape from a Satori, clearing one's mind entirely, mirrors Zen Buddhist practices of attaining inner stillness. In this way, the Satori legend doubles as a folk cautionary tale and a subtle spiritual lesson about the power of the ability to empty one's mind. Historically, the Satori entered written folklore during the Edo period, with the first documented recording of the creature coming in a 1712 encyclopedia. Folklorists have offered various interpretations of what the Satori really represents. One theory is that it started out as a mountain kami, a minor deity or spirit of the wild, that devolved into a yokai as people lost faith in the old nature gods. Another theory is that the creature grew out of a previous ghostly entity, which was said to haunt mountains and echo words back. For clarity's sake, a yokai is a supernatural entity from Japanese folklore, often described as spirits, demons, strange apparitions, or in modern times, as cryptids. They embody the mysterious, eerie, and sometimes playful aspects of the unseen world. Many interpretations of this creature are interwoven with Zen Buddhist lessons, and the stories may not be intended to be taken at face value. One of the most famous Satori legends tells of a lone woodcutter deep in the mountains who is stalked by the creature. Every time the woodcutter conceives a plan, whether to flee or to swing his axe, the Satori speaks his thought aloud in a mocking voice, thwarting any chance of surprise. Finally, in desperation, the man stops scheming and simply resumes chopping wood, trying to empty his mind. While he chops the wood, eventually the axe head breaks off and flies into the Satori, eliminating the ape creature on the spot. The tale's implicit moral is that only a truly empty mind can outwit the mind-reading Satori, mirroring the Zen teaching that stillness of mind can overcome even great obstacles. Folk traditions are generally less high-minded, and simply focus on the fact that the Satori wouldn't harm those who live and work respectfully in the mountains. In these stories, the creature preys mainly on outsiders, or people who look to exploit the mountain's riches, almost like a guardian spirit of the highlands, enforcing nature's rules. While the Satori is now largely regarded solely as a mythical being, this creature was once accepted as part of the order of the natural world. Interestingly, some have tried to tie the Satori to the case of the Hibagon, an ape-like cryptid which was reported in Japan in the 1970s. Notably, though, aside from both being ape-like creatures residing in the mountains, the two really have nothing in common at all. Medieval kings often left behind illegitimate children, but few are as enigmatic as Philip of Cognac. Philip was the only acknowledged illegitimate son of King Richard I of England, better known as Richard the Lionheart, and yet we know remarkably little about him. In particular, the identity of Philip's mother remains an unsolved mystery. Historians have scoured chronicles and records, but no contemporary source names the woman who bore Richard's son. This silence has fueled centuries of speculation and intrigue. Who was she, and why has history forgotten her? But that's not the only mystery that surrounds him, for there are tantalizing clues to suggest that he actually personally hunted down the man responsible for his father's death. Philip of Cognac was recorded as being born around 1180 and had the distinction of being the only known child, either legitimate or illegitimate, of Richard. He grew up during Richard's tumultuous reign, reaching adulthood by the late 1190s. His name of Cognac comes from the lordship of Cognac in the Charente region of France, a territory that became intertwined with his fate. Richard the Lionheart, famous for his exploits on crusade and in warfare, surprisingly took time to secure a future for Philip. The king arranged a marriage between Philip and Amelia of Cognac, a noble heiress and Richard's feudal ward. By marrying Amelia, Philip stood to inherit the castle and surrounding estates of Cognac, firmly rooting him in the political landscape of Richard's Duchy of Aquitaine. This was a strategic match orchestrated by Richard. Amelia's father, Ethier V, had been Lord of Cognac, and through her, Philip could claim that valuable estate. It appears Richard wanted to provide for his son, perhaps as a loyal vassal in Aquitaine, even though Philip could never inherit the English throne due to his illegitimacy. Unfortunately, the plans didn't fully pan out, to say the least. Amelia of Cognac died young, reportedly in 1199, and the couple had no children. After her death, King Richard retained the castle of Cognac, ultimately granting it to lesser noblemen in his service. Philip's brief taste of lordship ended as quickly as it began. Nevertheless, Philip of Cognac did make a mark on the chronicles, however faint. One chronicle by Roger of Howden claims that in 1199, after Richard was slain in battle, Philip avenged his father's death by hunting down the Viscount of Limoges. According to this, Aymar V, the rebellious Viscount, ultimately responsible for Richard's fatal wound, was brought down by his vengeful son, Philip. Howden wrote, Philip, illegitimate son of King Richard of England, slew the Viscount of Limoges in vengeance for his father. No other source confirms this dramatic episode. It may be only a legend. But it shows that Philip's contemporaries knew who he was. In fact, even King John, Richard's brother and successor, noted Philip's status. A 1201 royal account book cites a significant gift to Philip, son of King Richard. After that, Philip of Cognac disappears from the records. Some have suggested he likely died sometime in the early 13th century, still a young man. That said, the ultimate fate of Richard the Lionheart's only acknowledged son remains a complete mystery. All these details paint the outline of Philip's life: a youth in Aquitaine, a politically arranged marriage, a fleeting role in the violent drama of his father's demise, and then obscurity. Yet, amid these facts, one glaring question remains unanswered. Who was Philip's mother? Every mention of Philip carefully omits her name, referring to her only implicitly, if at all. To understand why Philip's mother might be missing from the record, it helps to look at Richard the Lionheart's personal life and attitudes. Unlike many kings of his era, or any era really, Richard had no legitimate children, and only one illegitimate child. He married relatively late, at age 34, to Queen Berengaria of Navarre. That marriage produced no offspring, and husband and wife spent much of their time apart. Richard was, of course, famous for his significant time spent abroad fighting in the Holy Land. This lack of an heir was a significant issue. Richard's absence of children meant that when he died in 1199, the crown passed to his brother John. Richard's father, Henry II, had numerous acknowledged illegitimate offspring, but Richard's case was very different. All evidence indicates that Philip's mother was simply never officially identified. Medieval chroniclers usually mentioned an illegitimate child's mother only if she was notable in her own right, for instance, a high-ranking noble. In Philip's case, every record is silent on her name and background, implying she was not of high rank or political importance. Roger of Howden, who detailed Philip's supposed act of vengeance, likewise gives no hint of maternal lineage. This lack of reference to his maternal line is sometimes used as evidence in support of the act of vengeance against the Viscount by Philip. After all, if the account was entirely fictional, why not invent a fictional maternal lineage to make the young man seem destined for heroism? Even administrative records, like that 1201 pipe roll entry from King John, acknowledge Philip while keeping his mother anonymous. This anonymity could be deliberate. It's possible that Philip's mother was a commoner or lower status noblewoman, whose liaison with Richard was a private matter. If she were a married woman or a daughter of one of Richard's vassals, there may have been a desire to keep the affair discreet to avoid scandal. However, some have speculated that by keeping her name out of official records, he kept the focus on Philip as his son, and only that. So with all the facts laid out, who could she have been? Based on Philip's estimated birth, circa 1180, Richard would have been about 22 or 23 years old at the time. Richard spent those years in Aquitaine, ruling as duke and quelling uprisings among his barons. It stands to reason that Philip's mother was a woman Richard knew in Aquitaine during that period. She might have been from the Cognac region or elsewhere in Poitou. Another possibility often floated is that Philip's mother was one of the unnamed women mentioned in tales of Richard's wartime cruelty. Some have suggested that, to put it mildly, Philip's mother was not there of her own accord. Such an origin would be all the more reason not to publicize the mother's name. If the mother was from a noble family, they would hardly want it known what had happened, especially if they were subsequently vassals of Richard. If she was a common woman, such an event would portray Richard, the supposedly pious crusader king, as a monster, ruthlessly exploiting those he ruled over in the most cruel and evil way. Whatever the case, the true fate of the only known son of Richard the Lionheart, as well as the identity of his mother, remains concealed by the mists of history. Perhaps the most controversial theory is that Philip wasn't actually Richard's son at all. As I mentioned previously, kings of this era got around. That is to say, they got busy, consistently and thoroughly. Some in the Angevin court and around the high courts of Europe started to question whether Richard preferred the company of men. After all, kings of the era routinely produced innumerable offspring, and something just wasn't adding up. Under this theory, Philip's mother may have been concealed to cover up the fact that Richard either wasn't the father or simply didn't enjoy the process as a king should. Keeping the mother's name under wraps would allow this royal secret to be covered up. However, it's important to note that this is essentially a 12th century rumor that's made it to the present, and there's no direct evidence to indicate this was the case.